Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the grand old story of a place that's basically the world's first mega brand, Rome. So, dim those lights, get comfy, and let your eyelids start their slow descent, because this is going to be, I don't know, a long, gentle ride through ancient dirt roads, toga parties, and emperors who sometimes forgot to wear pants. Now, Rome. Who doesn't know Rome? The city that went from a tiny settlement on the Tiber River to ruling most of the known world. Well, maybe you've heard bits and pieces, like Julius Caesar was stabbed in the back, and Nero played music as Rome burned, or whatever. But let's take it from the top, with a little more relaxed detail, shall we? Long, long ago, or technically around the 8th century BCE, there was a little village on the Italian peninsula. Just a handful of huts, a few stray pigs, and a lot of people probably wondering what the heck they were doing with their lives. According to legend, Rome was founded in 753 BCE by Romulus and Remus, twin brothers famously suckled by a she-wolf, which honestly sounds like the worst babysitting gig in history, but it makes for a pretty good story. Of course, most historians think the whole wolf thing is a myth, or at best, a poetic way of describing some ancient cultural myth that got exaggerated over time. But hey, myth or not, everyone loves a story where a kid is raised by a wolf. Makes things seem a little less dull. Anyway, the early Romans weren't really empire builders at first. They were just a collection of tribes, mostly farmers and shepherds, trying to get along with one another, probably arguing about whose turn it was to watch the sheep. Over time, they started forming a loose confederation of villages, sort of like a very slow-building group chat, except instead of emojis, they had swords and bronze spears. By the 6th century BCE, Rome was starting to emerge out of the tribal chaos into something resembling a proper city. They established a senate, yes, an ancient version of let's just talk it out, which surprisingly enough helped keep some order. Rome was also pretty good at making enemies, especially neighboring tribes and, later, competing city-states. But they had a secret weapon, their legions. Now, legions were pretty much the Roman version of a well-oiled, heavily armed social club. They fought in tight formations, in shiny armor, and probably took pride in their discipline. Though, if you think about it, they also had a peculiar knack for turning brutal war into a kind of militaristic fashion show. They expanded slowly, winning battles here and there, often by sheer organization, or, honestly, just by outnumbering their foes and having better sandwiches. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and Rome was a rising power with a pretty impressive ambition. So ambitious, in fact, that they decided to take on everyone nearby. They fought the Etruscans, the Samnites, and eventually the Greeks. The Greeks, of course, had their own civilization going on, full of philosophers, art, and democracy, things Rome would later incorporate, mostly by copying and then claiming they invented them first. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome was spreading out across Italy like a popular gossip. Then came the Punic Wars, the series of conflicts with Carthage, a wealthy North African city-state that was basically the Roman Empire's first real rival. Carthage was famous for its navy and for having a general named Hannibal, who, true to legend, crossed the Alps with elephants. Yes, elephants! Because why not double down on the weird? Hannibal's trek was legendary, though he mostly lost the war, but still, those elephants definitely made an impression. Rome, meanwhile, kept winning. They took control of Sicily, Spain, and North Africa. Pretty soon they had a sprawling empire that stretched from Spain all the way to Greece, with a little Mediterranean smudge in the middle. And all that success, naturally, it brought a mess of problems. The first major flaw in the Roman dream was that they had a habit of turning conquering into corruption. Wealth poured in, but so did greed. And let's be honest, like most empires, it started believing its own hype. They had gladiators, in case you were wondering, but it wasn't just for entertainment. It was also a way for Roman elites to show off their power and remind everyone they were still the top dogs. Nothing like a good blood sport to keep the peasants distracted, right? Now, let's float over to another royal disaster, because all empires, even the most legendary ones, have their share of chaos, corruption, and really weird personal lives. And Rome, well, Rome had plenty of emperors, each more eccentric and oftentimes more tragically doomed than the last. For now, let's sort of gently drift into the life of one of the earliest emperors, Augustus, the one who managed to go from a sneaky senator to the first true emperor of Rome. But first, take a moment to breathe. Relax in the knowledge that it's all just history. And history, after all, is just people doing stuff. Nothing too exciting, just the gentle march of time, punctuated by a few legions and a lot of toga-wearing drama.
All right, settle in a little deeper. We're about to meet Augustus, the guy who basically took the Roman Republic, liquid chaos, and turned it into an empire with the calmness of someone who's just really good at hiding their nerves behind a fancy toga. So, let's rewind a bit. Rome, by the time it's done fighting Carthage and the Greeks, has grown into this massive complex of political messiness. Rome was a republic, which sounds fancy, a government where the people supposedly had a say, thanks to the Senate and some electable officials. But in reality, it was more like a big club where the powerful elites kept fighting over who got to run the show, often resorting to backstabbing, bribes, and the occasional civil war just to keep it interesting. One of the most famous of these civil wars was between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Pompey was this rock star general who had way too many fans, and Caesar was, well, Caesar. A charming, ruthless, and slightly paranoid guy who knew how to win wars and also how to make enemies by the dozen. Caesar decided to cross the Rubicon River, a move so bold it's now a phrase meaning to do something irreversible, and basically declared, "I'm taking over now," leading to chaos. Caesar's so-called dictatorship was a game changer, but he got a little too popular for his own good. You see, Julius Caesar had this lovely habit of making everyone love him, sometimes too much. So some senators, worried he'd crown himself king or just run the place like his personal fiefdom, decided to stab him in the back, literally, on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. Classic Roman politicking, stabbings, and then a whole lot of chaos. And chaos it was. Out of that chaos rose a young man named Octavian, later called Augustus, who was actually Julius Caesar's adopted heir. Just a kid, really, probably wondering when his bedtime was, but he had a talent for quiet patience and hiding his ambitions behind a polite smile. So, Octavian was pretty good at playing the long game. After Caesar's death, the Roman world erupted into another round of civil wars, more stabbings, more plotting, and a whole lot of who's really in charge now. Eventually, Octavian managed to outplay everyone. He beat his rivals, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra, in a decisive naval battle at Actium in 31 BCE. Yes, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, whose love life was about as complicated as Roman politics, but that's another story for another time. With his rivals defeated, Octavian stood alone at the top. But here's the thing. Augustus, which means the revered one, didn't want to appear as a monarch or a king. That's a no-no in Roman tradition. Instead, he crafted a clever image. He was the restorer of the Republic, the guardian of tradition, and the first among equals. Basically, he wanted everyone to think Rome was still a republic because, of course, it was easier to keep power if no one thinks you've declared yourself emperor. And so, in 27 BCE, the Senate handed him a shiny new title, Augustus. It sounded regal without actually sounding like he was claiming divine kingship, at least openly.
Augustus cleverly kept the Senate around, gave himself control over the army, and reconfigured the government into what's known as the Principate, a fancy word for doing everything but calling yourself a king. He was a master of appearances. Augustus was a bit of a dramatic creator. He wore fancy clothes, promoted family values, and even claimed to have restored the golden age of Rome, which, knowing Rome's history, was basically a neon sign saying, "We're trying to forget all the bad stuff." He took credit for peace, stability, and building projects, all while quietly consolidating power behind the scenes. His personal life, of course, was just as curated as his public image. Augustus was married multiple times, which was typical Roman drama. Though oddly, his relationships sometimes seemed more about political alliances than genuine romance. His family scandals? Well, let's just say they wouldn't win any romantic comedies. His daughter Julia, for example, had a penchant for scandalous affairs that kept Roman senators gossiping long after Augustus kindly retired and left the messy family affairs to them. Augustus ruled for over 40 years, an impressive lifespan and reign, until his death in AD 14. And his death? Well, he slipped away quietly, possibly surrounded by his family, or maybe just the Roman Senate. Nobody's really sure, but that's the romantic part of it. After he died, the Romans declared him a god. Because, of course, everyone loves to worship their rulers once they're gone. And what did Augustus leave behind? A Roman Empire that was more stable, more organized, and let's be honest, more of a curated museum exhibit of imperial power. It was not a perfect system, of course. There were revolts, conspiracies, and plenty of shady deals behind the scenes. But from this point forward, Rome was officially an empire. Less of a chaotic republic and more of a well-oiled, sometimes crooked, but certainly powerful machine. So that's Augustus. Part magician, part politician, part sleep-inducing bedtime story hero. His reign was the quiet, patient beginning of a dynasty that would last for centuries, or at least until the Visigoths decided to roll in and steal the furniture. Now, relax a little more. Breathe in the history, breathe out the chaos, and get ready to drift into the next chapter, because it's going to be a long, winding ride through the fall of that very empire Augustus so carefully built.
All right, settle in a little deeper. We've had our slow, calming tour of Augustus's reign, so now let's stretch out our limbs and take a leisurely stroll through what's left of the Roman Empire. Or at least, what's left of its pride. After Augustus, Rome kept on going. Kind of. Power was passed from one emperor to another, some better than others, but all of them pretty much doing their best to keep Rome from falling apart completely. The trouble was, Rome was getting really big, so big that it started to feel like trying to hold on to a giant, wobbly Jell-O mold. No matter how much you tighten your grip, bits of it were bound to slip. Let's talk about Emperor Nero, because if someone was going to rewrite the book on bad rulers, Nero would be a great start. Nero was, to put it mildly, a piece of work. He ascended to the throne at the ripe old age of 17, probably because his mother and the court decided, hey, let's see if we can make a really dramatic emperor. And boy, did Nero deliver. He was famously theatrical. He loved singing, acting, and probably throwing wild parties where nobody looked too closely at the guest list. Nero's rule was marked by lavish spending, terrible decisions, and a fondness for burning things down, literally. When Rome suffered a great fire in AD 64, rumors swirled that Nero was actually playing his lyre and singing while the city burned, which of course is a total myth. Probably. In reality, Nero blamed the Christians, started persecutions, and poured resources into rebuilding a city that was forever scarred by flames. His reign was a roller coaster of bizarre excess. He even declared himself a brilliant artist and spent half his time performing on stage, which was considered incredibly scandalous behavior for a Roman emperor. Of course, in Nero's mind, he was a star, whether the Senate liked it or not. Things didn't end well for Nero. The Senate finally realized maybe this guy is a little too much. And in AD 68, he was declared a public enemy, an enemy of the state, which in Roman terms meant the state got to kill him. Nero, ever the showman, chose to take his own life, apparently with a dramatic sigh and a last quip. Probably. Either way, his death marked the beginning of a chaotic year known as the Year of the Four Emperors, because, obviously, Roman politics were in a free fall. Let's float over to another emperor, Vespasian, who, unlike Nero, knew how to keep things pretty straightforward. Vespasian inherited a crumbling empire and decided, let's just fix the problem without causing too much fuss. He focused on restoring order, taxing the provinces, and building stuff. Most famously the Colosseum, that grand arena where Romans watched everything from gladiator fights to exotic animal hunts, all while secretly wondering if they should have just stayed home and watched TV instead. Vespasian's family, especially his sons Titus and Domitian, kept the empire chugging along with mixed results. Titus is remembered fondly for things like delivering aid after disasters, though his brief reign was also marked by the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which was a kind of Roman oops moment. Domitian, on the other hand, was more dictator-y. Sidebar, he liked to dress in shiny armor and sometimes just declare himself emperor for life, because why not double down? As the centuries rolled on, Rome's borders were under constant threat. Barbarian tribes like the Visigoths, Huns, and Vandals started to drift closer, looking to see if Rome's empire was ripe for the taking. They didn't come all at once. Nope, it was more like a slow creeping invasion, strategically sneaking in through cracks and weak spots. And let's be honest, the Roman Empire was already pretty fragile at this point, crumbling like a stale cookie. One of the most notable invasions was in AD 1010, when the Visigoths, led by King Alaric, finally sacked Rome itself. Yes, Rome, once the Eternal City, was sacked. The city was plundered, burned, and walked all over like a long-lost cousin who turned out to be a lot less impressive in person. And the Romans? Well, they kept calm, mostly by pretending it wasn't happening, and of course blaming someone else. The empire was slowly losing its grip. The western half especially was becoming a shadow of its former self, more like a collection of fortified hilltops rather than a unified empire. Meanwhile, the East, what's now Turkey, Greece, and the Middle East, continued on, calling themselves the Byzantine Empire. They kept themselves organized in an admittedly more refined way, but it was like watching the same show from a different angle. So here's the thing about the decline of Rome. It didn't happen overnight. It was a long, subtle process, more of a gentle shakiness than a dramatic fall. Just like trying to keep your candles lit during a gentle breeze, Rome's instability grew bit by bit. Political corruption, economic troubles, military overreach, and the constant pressure from outside tribes, all quietly chipping away at what was once a mighty empire. And yet, amidst all this chaos, there were moments of brilliance, like the founding of Constantinople or the artistic and cultural achievements of the Byzantines. Rome's story wasn't just a tragedy. It was also a long, winding saga of resilience, decay, and quiet resilience again. Now, take a deep breath and let your mind drift as we slowly glide toward the end of this saga. We'll see how this mighty empire gradually turned into a whisper of what it once was, all while the world kept turning.
Okay, settle in deeply now, because we're approaching the end of the line for the Western Roman Empire. It's a story of slow disappearance, like a faint whisper carried away by the breeze. So find your most comfortable pose, breathe out the chaos, and let's glide gently along. By the early 5th century AD, Rome was more of a shadow of its former self, kind of like that worn-out sofa in Grandma's basement, familiar but visibly frayed, with cushions that have seen better days. The empire was riddled with internal strife,
economic downturns, and a steady parade of barbarian tribes knocking politely, or not so politely, on the city gates. The last few emperors of the Western Roman Empire were a series of pretty forgettable names, mostly because many of them didn't last long enough to make much of a mark. There was Honorius, a kid-turned-emperor who seemed mostly interested in doing as little as possible, probably because he was busy playing a game of "Can I outsource responsibility today?" His reign was largely characterized by chaos, with various barbarians taking turns sacking different parts of Italy. And across the street, we have Valentinian III, who was also more interested in minor court scandals than empire stability. His reign saw the Vandals, a Germanic tribe led by Genseric, march right into North Africa, seizing the rich grain supplies that fed much of the empire. And because they were efficient and well-organized, they managed to sack Carthage in 439 AD, turning the breadbasket of Rome into a burned-out shell. Meanwhile, the city of Rome itself, once the proud jewel of the empire, was increasingly just a relic, deteriorating, filled with ruins and home mostly to the poor and desperate. The empire had become more of a symbol than a functioning state, a marvel of tradition and architecture that nobody quite knew how to preserve anymore. One of the final blows came in 476 AD, the famous date supposedly marking the fall of Rome. That's when Romulus Augustulus, a young emperor heavily overshadowed by his father's ambitions, was deposed by Odoacer, a barbarian chieftain. Now, some say Romulus was just a puppet, but history remembers him as the last emperor of the West, a young guy who had the misfortune of living in a collapsing empire and probably just wanted to go home. Odoacer, who didn't bother declaring himself emperor because, honestly, who would bother, sent a polite letter to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople saying, "Hey, Rome just kind of fell apart, but we're sort of still here doing our thing." And thus the Western Roman Empire quietly ceased to exist, like a whispered secret fading into the wind. Meanwhile, in the East, the Byzantine Empire continued, more polished, more organized, and definitely more resilient. They kept Roman traditions alive, sort of like a long, slow sleep that stretched for another 1,000 years until it too eventually drifted off. So, what does all this mean? Well, it's a story of gradual disappearance. No single battle or siege brought down Rome. Instead, it was a slow dissolution, like a sandcastle slowly being eroded by the tide. The empire's institutions, its armies, its culture, all of it gradually unraveled over generations. But here's a gentle irony. Even after the fall, Rome's influence remained. Its roads, laws, and ideas continued on, just in different forms and different places. The Holy Roman Empire, medieval Europe, the Renaissance, all of them borrowed bits and pieces of that ancient Roman spirit, sewn into new stories, new crowns, and new crowns of thorns. And as you relax further into your seat or bed, remember history is like that, an endless cycle of rise and fall, chaos and calm, decay and rebirth. The details may fade, but the echoes remain. Now, take a deep breath, let your eyelids flutter shut, and drift into the calm after the long, winding journey of the Roman Empire, knowing that even in its quietest moments, history whispers softly in the background.